Okay, folks, I did a video within the past week or so regarding 5 states, and as it turned out, it was 6 that had their voter suppression laws, i.e. their voter ID laws, struck down or greatly modified because they were discriminating against various groups, primarily black people, but also Native Americans. The states that had their voter ID laws basically struck down or modified were North Dakota, Kansas, Wisconsin, Texas, and North Carolina. Well, North Dakota had the good sense to accept the ruling and go back to the way things previously were in North Dakota before they put the laws on the books. But you have 2 of the biggest perpetrators of voter suppression, Texas and North Carolina, appealing the Court of Appeals decisions to the Supreme Court. Now, since the court is basically 4-4 at this time, there's not a lot of hope for them to get that decision reversed. But they're trying to do an end around temporarily by asking the court, the Supreme Court, to issue a stay of the Court of Appeals rulings so that they can keep their voter suppression laws in place temporarily until the full court can hear their cases. Now, the court, again, the Supreme Court, has accepted their request but not made a ruling on it, and they are giving the opponents of the voter ID laws until Thursday to make their case as to why they shouldn't issue a stay. Now, the people that are opposing the North Carolina law, their case should be fairly easy given the opinion written by the Court of Appeals that covered North Carolina. I think it was the Fourth Circuit, if I'm not mistaken. But folks, that's just letting you know how important the suppression of voting is to these Republican-controlled states. Obviously, North Carolina, Texas, Wisconsin, Kansas, North Dakota. And in the video, I failed to mention that Ohio attempted to do it. But the people rose up in Ohio and got a petition signed and then a referendum placed on the ballot in order to vote on the voter ID laws that they were trying to put in place. Kasich saw the handwriting on the wall, and as did the legislature, and they withdrew the law. So that was a victory that proponents against the law won without having to go through all of the courts and all the legal battles. That was the smart thing to do and the best way to go. All right. Anyway, Fox basically is providing information as to what's going down as far as North Carolina and Texas are concerned, as they go kicking and clawing to try to hang on to these laws to try to maintain Republican power as much as possible and to restrict the people from voting. Here's the clip from Fox.
Dozen states across the country have some form of voter identification law on the books, which requires people to show ID at the polls. Some of those laws are being challenged, and a few even face rulings from the Supreme Court. Chief Washington correspondent James Rosen is live in D.C. with more on all of that. James.
John, good afternoon. The Supreme Court just yesterday received an emergency request from the state of North Carolina asking the justices to temporarily block an appeals court ruling striking down the Tar Heel State's voter ID law. In response, Supreme Court Chief Justice John Roberts gave the opponents of that law until 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Thursday, August 25th, to respond. Legal analysts regard North Carolina's bid to preserve its voter ID law as a long shot, but note that how the Roberts Court, now down to 8 members with the death of Justice Antonin Scalia in February, handles this case could impact legal battles over voter ID laws in other states that could soon reach the High Court.
The Supreme Court has upheld voter ID laws, so there's no question that they're constitutional. Some are questioning how they're being implemented or specific laws are being passed. So you can make too much of this, but voter ID laws are in 38 some odd states, and about 70% of Americans, including minorities, support them.
Texas has also filed an appeal to the Supreme Court following a similar ruling from an appellate court deeming the Lone Star State's voter ID law unconstitutional. The impetus behind these laws was to cut down on voter fraud. Proponents contend that our most precious franchise should be treated with the same reverence reserved for boarding airplanes and buying cigarettes, meaning individuals ought to be able to show identification as proof of residency. Opponents say such laws discriminate against minorities who are less likely to possess identification.
The courts are essentially saying these are illegal, they're impermissible. The effect that these laws have on Americans is that they are suppressing their right to vote. And because of that, because states have not shown that there's a compelling state reason to have these on the books, they're being struck down.
Wisconsin also saw a recent defeat for voter ID laws with a federal district judge there striking down such a measure. John.
Interesting. James Rosen in.
All right, so they can't even camouflage what they're doing. They claim the reason for the voter ID laws is because of fraud, but they cannot substantiate that. And I forget which state it was. I think it was Wisconsin, when the Court of Appeals justice asked them how many cases of actual voter fraud they had. The attorneys for the state had to tell the truth, obviously, and they stated 0, but they just wanted to be proactive. And that basically blew their case out of the water. And all of the states that are claiming that they need these laws in order to prevent fraud, there is almost no, I can't say absolutely 0, because in truth, in the state of Pennsylvania, over I believe it was Pennsylvania, over a 3-year period of time, they had 21 cases of voter fraud. Now, hearing the number 21, yeah, man, that's quite a bit. That's 21 cases of voter fraud in a total of 1 billion votes cast. 1 billion votes cast, you have 21 cases of voter fraud. That number is so infinitesimal that it's laughable. 21 cases, and again, they were cases, they didn't say convictions, they said cases of voter fraud. 21 votes is not going to swing any election unless possibly you're talking about maybe a school board, possibly it's not even going to be a county sheriff. 21 votes is not going to swing an election on the county sheriff, but something minuscule. Okay, now remember, that's over years. That's not all at once. That's over years. So that's not going to have any effect on any election. But again, these guys are going screaming, kicking, and fighting to try to maintain the percentage of their voters, Republican voters, versus African American voters who probably vote Democratic. So they're trying to, in Donald Trump's words, rig an election. This is not going to work, and I hope that the Supreme Court can see through the North Carolina and Texas bullshit, because, again, the opinion that was written in the North Carolina case was so scathing that there can be no doubt that they weren't trying to do this to prevent fraud. They were trying to do this to restrict the African American vote. And in the opinion, it was written that the North Carolina legislature focused like a laser on all of the characteristics of African American voters, and then they targeted each thing that they did one at a time and placed restrictions on all of those things within the law. Things like early voting, weekend voting, registration, number of polling places, souls to the polls, which is the Sunday voting, where after church services they would march down or get transported down to a registration location, and basically the entire church, all of the church members that weren't registered would register. Well, they killed that. So, and then they also knocked out a week of early voting, where the statistics show that 70% of African Americans were taking advantage of the early voting. So they couldn't kill early voting 100%, but instead of having it out for 2 weeks, they basically reduced it to 1 week. And then they reduced the number of places where you could early vote from, I believe it was approximately 20 places that you could early vote. They reduced it down to 1. So now you tell me if they weren't targeting. Anyway, I'm going to keep up on this one because voting is very important. Whether you like the candidates that are currently running for president, now you got your choice of 4 at this point, and possibly 5 if you're in Utah. But you got to make a decision, and not voting is abdicating your responsibility to vote. Pick somebody. Pick somebody. Even if you go third party, at least cast your vote.